Okay, segment 3 for Monday. Pick up with the Japanese fierce opposition as the Americans attempt to end World War II in the Pacific. We talked about Iwo Jima as a place where a small island that took a large number of casualties for the Americans. You can see the picture here in the bottom left, which is actually the same picture that is recreated in the Marine Corps memorial that you'll find in Washington, D.C., and that's the Marines putting the flag on top of Mount Suribachi at Iwo Jima, showing how difficult it was to win that particular battle. And in fact, many of the guys you see there holding that flag up were killed not long after that, or later on in the war. So we left off having discussed the Manhattan Project that created the first atomic bomb, and talking a little bit about Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So let's go back to our map, and you can see here's Iwo Jima, which we discussed, and then the invasion of Okinawa that took place in April and through June of 1945 was the one that took 40,000 American casualties. The plan at that point, Germany had already surrendered and Japan was holding on. The plan at that point was to actually physically invade the home islands of Japan, and the predictions of American casualties only in this invasion were somewhere around 1 million American soldiers that would probably be killed or wounded in order to take the entire home island of Japan itself. Many American troops that had fought in World War II in Europe were on trains going across the United States to get onto boats from California and West Coast states in order to be sent to this theater and be part of the potential invasion that was supposed to take place in September of 1945. But before that occurred, the United States dropped the 2 atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Now, when taken by themselves, they seem to be sort of overkill, or things that don't make a whole lot of sense, almost as if the Americans were just flexing their muscles. But there's a lot of things that we have to consider when it comes to the atomic bombs, and we'll discuss those in class. But the main point is that these 2 bombs were dropped, and as a consequence of them, the war actually ended. It was not long after that that the Japanese decided to surrender, and it actually took place on September 1st of 1945, which is known as VJ Day, as in Victory in Japan. We'll discuss the bombs and the moral and ethical questions, as well as their impact on the world in general. But it is true, and perhaps somewhat ironic, that the only nation on earth that's ever used this terrible weapon against other human beings is the United States. So we have VJ Day, September 1st, 1945, as the Japanese surrender after the atomic bombs have been dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Now that leads us to the end of the war, which of course, again, you can win the war and not win the peace. This picture in the middle, which is the iconic picture of the celebration actually on VE Day, and the 2 people who were in it were followed by the press for years and years afterwards, just kind of kept up with. The man there, who is a sailor who was actually on leave, is actually a guy, I believe, from Dallas, and he died recently, as did the woman who was in that picture. But the jubilation of just grabbing someone you didn't know and kissing them just tells you that the American people were very, very happy about the end of the war, as were most of the people on the victorious sides. For our purposes, Harry Truman takes over. Now, this is important. Truman was a man who ends up having a huge impact on the 20th century, although he was chosen again really without a whole lot of renown by the Democratic Party, or even being very well known by the American people. He was from Missouri. He was known as a plain talker. In fact, he cussed quite often, and the press eventually made commentary about that. But he was a guy who liked to cut through a lot of the red tape and problems of government and go directly to what was happening. So one of the things that happens as far as domestic policy is that when he takes over, he wants to try and continue New Deal programs and begins what he calls his Fair Deal, which really doesn't get a whole lot of support from the American people, because what we'll end up with in the 1950s, and in fact beginning at 45 and into the 50s, is that the American people will sort of behave the way they did after World War I, wanting to enjoy the fruits of their labor. They've crusaded again. Now it's time to enjoy the success that we have. And it's actually following World War II that the United States becomes the economic powerhouse that it still remains today. So the idea of creating a whole bunch of new social programs and dealing with a whole other group of crusades is something that didn't get a lot of support. And in fact, the Democrats are voted out of Congress beginning in 1946. Actually, it began in 44, and it really, the Republicans take over Congress in 1946. So Truman actually faces a Republican Congress once he is elected on his own. But the idea of a whole bunch of new programs just didn't appeal to the American people at that point. You can see Republicans take over Congress for the first time since the Depression. And one of the things that the Republicans do here that's kind of interesting is that they pass a law called the Taft-Hartley Act. Now, they passed it by overriding Truman's veto, which tells you that they had quite a few votes in both the House and the Senate in order to do that. And it's actually one that reversed some of the things that the Democrats had done during the New Deal to help unions. It was really a continuation of this argument between big business versus unions, the wealthy and the rich versus the common man, and to an extent. But the Taft-Hartley Act was an important response by the Republicans to their view that the Democrats had really gone overboard in supporting the unions in the argument between business and labor. Now, one of the things that was passed towards the end of the war, and as it says here, yes, it can happen, and by that I mean Congress actually did something right, which it seems to occur rarely enough that we actually comment on it in history. But it was passed in 1944, and it actually dealt with a transition from war to peace in mind. Now, one of the things that usually happens is that our government tends to respond to things after the fact, but in this particular case, you have to give Congress a lot of credit for creating legislation that was originally proposed or put together while Roosevelt was still president before Truman took over. But it was legislation that was designed to deal with something that they saw coming and actually not only worked, but worked very well. And this was what becomes known as the GI Bill. Now, the term GI is what was generally used for anybody that was in the military, although it didn't work in some cases. But generally, people were called GI because it stood for government issue, and everything that they had, from their haircuts to the way they spoke and the activities they did and their clothing, was all issued by the government. So this was an attempt to do something about what was on the horizon, and that was the massive armies, navies, and other armed forces that had been created would be sending their members home to a world where they wouldn't have a job in particular, and there would be a massive number of people who would enter the economy after the war. So the question is, how do you make that transition from war to peace, and how do you do it in a way that helps those who have provided for the defense of the United States? And this legislation did a great job at dealing with some of these major issues. Number one, as you can see here, it provided loans for college education. Now, interestingly, what this kind of does is it takes the government and gives people very cheap loans guaranteed by the government that banks would actually provide, but the government would guarantee to go to college. And what this did for many Americans was they became the first person in their family, the first generation in their family, to actually attend college. It also, by sending them to college, sort of delayed their impact on the economy, because they could spend 3, 4, 5 years being students as opposed to going out and looking for full-time employment. So it was a good sort of a delay tactic. It also, of course, as you might suspect, helped to educate them with the new technologies that had come out of the war, the new things that they could do, and prepare them much better for post-war life than they would have been prepared just by coming out of the military. Second thing it did was provide loans for people to create homes. Now, one of the offshoots of the end of this war is one you're probably familiar with, and that is, since the American people had seen their men and women split up by the war, once they got back together, there was what was called a baby boom, and we'll be talking about this for quite a while. It still has an impact on us today, and it is a large increase, or a great percentage increase, in the number of babies who were born between 1946 and 1964. That's the actual baby boom. And one of the things that was part of the GI Bill was helping people who became couples and began to start families very quickly after the war to have a place to live. And so it provided loans for people to buy houses. And it was interesting because in a lot of ways this hit a lot of the other issues that the post-war era brought up. Many of these homes were built in processes that were part of the whole wartime mentality of doing everything in a regimented way, doing it as far as mass production. And the picture you see down here in the right corner is a picture of one of the first suburbs that was built under this idea, called Levittown, outside of New York City. And every house was exactly the same. And it began really, if that doesn't look like something you'd see in our suburbs today, then you haven't looked at a map of our suburbs, because this is the tract home, the idea of them all being generally the same. And the key ingredient here was not so much that they just built these sort of ubiquitous suburbs like we have today, but the important thing is that it gave people jobs when they came back from the war in the housing industry. So not only did it help provide homes for these new families, but it also gave them loans in order to get those homes at a relatively cheap price, and it also put a lot of people to work in the economy building these homes. And so again, it's another thing they did that had a lot of great effects, a lot of outstanding effects that last for a long time, but also helped the transition. Now, the third thing that was in there that was really part of the GI Bill for our purposes is that it provided unemployment insurance. If you got out of the military and you couldn't find a job, the government would make sure that you had some money so you could start your family, you could look for a job, you could go to school, you could do whatever it is that you needed to do, and that helped in the transition too. And as it says here, GI loans are still part of the incentive package today for today's military to help them buy homes and also to get into school. But in the post-war era, it was a key spark to the explosion of our economy and helped to create the brain power that's fueled our creativity and innovation ever since. We now move to Truman, the UN, and the Cold War. So we're going to find that once the hot war of World War II was over, the Cold War began almost immediately. Now, the first thing we have to do is compare the end of World War II to the end of World War I. And you recall that the U.S. Buried its head in the sand after World War I, but the lesson that many people believe they learned from World War II was to never appease aggression, and that nations that believe in freedom must work together. And so instead of avoiding international connections, the United States helped to create them. Literally, the meeting to decide exactly how to create a post-war organization that would work rather than the creating something that had the futility of the League of Nations. The meeting itself was held in San Francisco, and in April through June of 1945, the nations that met there, including the United States, put together the proposal and the format for the United Nations. The United Nations was chartered in October of 1945, and instead of avoiding it, the United States is actually going to have it within its own territory in New York City. Now, the original structure of the United Nations had four major powers, victorious, of course, in World War II, that would be on what's called the Security Council. And the Security Council would make the votes on the most important things and could veto anything that the General Assembly, which is all the other nations, could vote for. Now, the four policemen, or four permanent members, were to be the United States, the British, the Soviets, the other great victor in World War II, and then China. Now, you have to remember that at this point, China is believed to be a nation that will come out of World War II as a democracy. But as we'll see, China had had a civil war before World War II. The two sides that were fighting joined together to fight the Japanese during the war, and then once the war has ended, they go at it again. And unfortunately for the history of democracy in the world, the Chinese communists under Mao Zedong win that civil war. But for a short period of time, and when the UN was being created, China itself was seen to be potentially a democracy. And so it's part of the permanent four policemen on the Security Council. Now, most Americans argue that the USSR began the Cold War, and this is an argument that's made through the view that the Russians actually violated some of the pledges they had made during and right after the war about allowing people in other areas other than their own nation to decide who would rule them and what type of governance they would have. This is called self-determination. But very quickly after World War II ended, we find that Eastern Europe, which was controlled by communist troops, is a place that seemed to vote, and that's in quotation marks, for communism. And ironically, it was actually Winston Churchill who coined the phrase the Iron Curtain, and we'll pick up with that in our next segment.